السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. And welcome to another video on the Islamic Knowledge YouTube channel. And in today's video, we're looking at an amazing book titled The Second Formation of Islamic Law, the Hanafi School in the Early Modern Ottoman Empire by Guy Burak. And this book has been printed by Cambridge, as you can see at the bottom here. And I have got my notes on the book as well, which I will put on the Islamic Knowledge Telegram channel. So if you go onto Telegram and type in @IK courses and join the Telegram channel, I'll upload a PDF of these notes on the channel as well. So now, what's this book all about? As we know, the title is all to do with the Ottoman Empire, but it's all to do with Islamic law as well. Essentially, this book is a study of how the Ottomans revived the Hanafi madhhab, and particularly how the scholars of the Ottoman imperial class, so when I say imperial class, that means those who are connected to the Ottoman Empire itself, they're connected to the royalty, as you could call it, how these scholars, those who are connected to the imperial class, or they were part of the imperial hierarchy, how they interacted with the Hanafi scholars of the Arab lands, which the Ottomans had conquered around the start of the 16th century at the hands of Sultan Selim. So the book is about 223 pages of solid reading. So as we look here, there are three, I believe, as appendices at the end. So 223 pages of proper reading, you could say, and then followed by, there are about 3 appendices. There's Appendix A, Appendix B, and Appendix C, and we're going to come to what they're all about just now as well. So as you can see also from the contents page of the book, so if we were to have a look at the contents page of the book is divided into 5 chapters. So you can see here chapter 1, chapter 2, Chapter 3, Chapter 4, Chapter 5. Now, what's this book all about? In the introduction, the author speaks about the notion of a madhhab. So that's this chapter that's titled. It doesn't really have a title, but it starts off about muftis. And it speaks about the position or the notion of a madhhab and how the Ottomans created a system in Islamic education wherein if you want an official position in the Ottoman lands, such as a judge, then you need to have studied in the Ottoman madrasa. So they institutionalized education, if you want to say it like that. Or you need to have traveled to Istanbul, or you need to have gained some form of patronage. The first chapter, so that's the introduction, I apologize, not the mufti section, that's the introduction. Then in chapter 1, which is where the book actually now starts, the author speaks about the position of muftis, and the author compares this position in the Mamluk period and then how this position developed in the Ottoman period. So we've got the Mamluks that kind of existed before the Ottomans, or even around the same time, but soon they were kind of taken over by the Ottomans. How did they visualize, or how did they what was their perception of the position of a mufti, and what was the difference in the Ottoman period? So this book is a study of intellectual history once again, and it's a really, really fantastic read. So the Ottoman period was a period wherein the position of a mufti became more institutionalized, as in there were free roaming muftis, but you had official muftis as well. The author speaks about, in this section, as you can see here, Abdul Ghani al-Nablusi and his response to al-Haskafi over the position of a mufti. Chapter 2 is also really interesting, wherein the author speaks about various Tabagat books of the Hanafi madhhab, and he's explaining how the Ottoman scholars felt a genuine loyalty to the Ottoman Empire. So he discusses, if I were to just go to chapter 2 because of just how brilliant it is, he speaks about Ibn Kamal Basha's Tabagat, and he goes into real detail here onto the Ibn Kamal Basha's Tabagat. So he has Ibn Kamal Pasha, his Tabagat. Then he speaks about Kinali Zada, who's also famously known as Ibn al-Hinai. Most of us will know him as Ibn al-Hinai, but a lot of people also call him Kinali Zada. He's known by both titles, but his Tabagat al-Hanafiya was also, you could say, an Ottoman Tabagat book, in the sense that it's written by an Ottoman scholar, or he's living in the Ottoman lands, and you could say it's it's in support of the Ottoman Empire and sponsored to some degree by the Ottoman Empire as well. Then he's got a discussion on Kataibu A'lam al-Akhyar. Again, these books have now been printed. Kinali Zada's Tabagat is printed, as you can see. Kafawi's Kataibu A'lam al-Akhyar is also printed, as you can see in the center of the screen here. And also after that, he speaks about Muhammad Kami's Maham al-Fuqaha, which has also been printed, as you can see in the center of the screen here. He speaks about that in quite a bit of detail as well, how this book came about, etc. And then he also speaks a little bit about, and this book is actually quite interesting in the sense that some of these books, as we will discuss, they have actually been commanded or they've been sponsored by the Ottoman Emperor himself. Then we've got a discussion on Tash Kubri Zada's Ash-Shaqa'iq An-Nu'maniyya, and this is again printed, you can see a picture of it. It's really, really interesting if you're into Hanafi Tabaqat. Now, chapter 3 kind of builds on chapter 2. So if I were to go back to the contents page here, chapter 3 is more or less building on chapter 2. Chapter 2 was all about the Tabaqat of the Hanafi books, Tabaqat of the Hanafis in general. Chapter 3 builds upon that, and he discusses various Tabaqat books of the Hanafi madhhab, and he's explaining how these Tabaqat books in chapter 3 have been written by scholars of the Arab lands that were being ruled by the Ottomans, i.e. these scholars were not exactly patrons of the Ottoman Empire. They're not going to feel, although they were loyal to the Ottoman Empire, they're not going to feel a sense of real protection over the Ottoman Empire in that sense. And these were two scholars, primarily Ibn Tulun in his Al-Ghuraf Al-Aliyah, which has also been printed, as you can see in the center of the screen. And also he speaks about Taqiyuddin At-Tamimi's Tabaqat As-Saniyya. So if we were to go to chapter 3, he kind of reads quite a bit into it. He feels like as though the Tabaqat books that have been written by scholars of the Arab lands were more or less trying to respond to the Ottoman Tabaqat books, which were promoting more Turkish ulama or Ottoman ulama. I feel like it's reading too much into it, but it still makes for a very interesting discussion. He speaks about Tabaqat As-Saniyya here, and he speaks about Al-Ghuraf Al-Aliyah, Ibn Tulun's Al-Ghuraf Al-Aliyah right here. Really, really interesting chapter, to be honest. Chapter 4 speaks about the idea of reliable books, and it's a really, really interesting chapter. What we call in Arabic the Mutun al-Mu'tabara. How did these Mutun al-Mu'tabara come about? Again, he reads a bit too much into how they may have come about. He feels like the Ottomans kind of, to push certain views, they made certain books become mutuni mu'tabara. Again, in any case, it makes for a very interesting chapter. He doesn't push for the idea too much as well, by the way, but he really does discuss all the mutuni mu'tabara in a really, really interesting contextualized manner. And then the final chapter, which is chapter 5, speaks a little bit more about the inner workings of the Ottoman system when it came to fatwas and court cases. How did it actually used to work? And that's a really, really interesting chapter. And then we've got right at the end a conclusion as well. Now, this book is actually filled with beneficial points from start to finish, even if some points are reading a little bit too much into certain ideas. But I want to go through some of these interesting points, and you will really appreciate this book, I think, once you see some of these points. On page 9, the author explains how the mihna impacted how the fuqaha would now interact with the state. So he writes here, if you have a look in the footnotes, so you have to kind of zoom in a little bit here. As a result of the events of the following decades, and especially the Abbasid Inquisition, the mihna, during the reign of Harun al-Rashid's son Al-Ma'mun, jurists increasingly asserted their independence from the state in regulating the content of Islamic law. And then he gives a reference to Muhammad Qasim Zaman. On page 39, the author speaks about the imperial learned hierarchy in the Ottoman Empire and how the Shaykh al-Islam position started to develop as an institutional position after the conquest of Constantinople. And that's when really things started to pick up. So he says from around the mid 15th century, roughly at the time of the conquest of the new imperial capital, which is Istanbul or Constantinople, the still evolving Ottoman ruling and religious elites gradually developed a hierarchy of judiciary positions and madrasas. An integral dimension of this process was the emergence of the chief mufti, the Shaykh al-Islam, to become by the mid 16th century the supreme office in the Ottoman judicial hierarchy, which is quite interesting to learn a little bit about the history of the position of Shaykh al-Islam. Then he explains on page 41 that the Shaykh al-Islam by 1550s had become the head of the learned hierarchy. So he speaks here, much more is known about the office of the Shaykh al-Islam than that of his provincial subordinates. As already mentioned, by the mid 16th century, the Shaykh al-Islam had emerged as the head of the hierarchy. On page 163, the author discusses how Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih, the conqueror of Constantinople, he used to honor the famous author of Durar al-Hukam, and he had a lot of respect for him. He was actually one of his students. He was a student of the author of Durar al-Hukam, who is Mullah Khusro. So this chapter 5 actually starts off with a quote from the actual quote comes from Ash-Shaqa'iq An-Nu'maniyya and other books as well. But he says here, when he entered the Hagia Sophia mosque for prayer, he entered the door of the mosque. All the people, adults and children, stood up and opened the way to the mihrab for him. Maulana Mullah Khusrev also greeted the people on both sides as he was proceeding up to the front row. Several times Sultan Mehmed Khan, which is basically Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih, watched this situation occurring from his upper prayer place and said to his viziers in Arabic, behold, this is the Abu Hanifa of his time. Returning to Ottoman Turkish, that is, he was proud of Mullah Husrov, saying, this is the grand Imam, i.e. Abu Hanifa of our era. On page 117, the author explains how although the Ottomans now had an imperial learned class of scholars, i.e. scholars of the empire, you could say, it doesn't mean that they considered those not holding an official position. So for example, if you are not an official mufti, it's not that they considered these scholars to be like an outcast or anything. So for example, Ibn Nujaym, At-Tumurtashi, all of these scholars, they were not officially appointed muftis, Khairuddin al-Ramli as well, yet still they were very much respected and their books even made it into the Ottoman syllabus. So he says here, and he's speaking about Ibn Nujaym here, he says here, it is noteworthy that both Ibn Nujaym and At-Tumurtashi were acknowledged as eminent scholars by members of the Ottoman imperial learned hierarchy, and that some of their works entered the Ottoman imperial canon, as we shall see in the next chapter. And this worked the other way around too, as in, what I mean by that is the scholars who are not part of the learned hierarchy, Ottoman learned hierarchy, they would respect the Ottoman Empire as well quite a lot. So the author mentions on page 15 about how those who didn't hold an official position in the Ottoman Empire, and they would sometimes be from the Arab lands as well, to a large degree as well sometimes, they had a lot of respect still for the Ottoman Empire as well. So he mentions here, on the other hand, as chapter 1 examines, jurists who were not affiliated with the imperial hierarchy attempted in various ways to justify and retain their position within the imperial landscape on the basis of legal arguments that were accepted by the members of the learned hierarchy as well. Moreover, the vast majority of the jurists that inhabit the chapters that follow were loyal Ottoman subjects, and some of the locally acclaimed jurists who were not members of the learned hierarchy authored treatises in which they praised the Ottoman dynasty, and that actually includes Tumurtashi, who wrote a book in the praise of the Ottoman Empire. Another super beneficial point, by the way, on page 155 is about Alauddin al-Haskafi, the famous author of Ad-Durr al-Mukhtar, and I found this super interesting. So because al-Haskafi had traveled to Constantinople and was an officially appointed mufti of Damascus, he seems to have had more access to the Ottoman books than maybe some of his other contemporaries will have had. So he had access to the books of the Arab scholars as well as the Ottoman scholars. So he writes, Al-Haskafi's biography and career are crucial for understanding his bibliography. Officially appointed provincial muftis across Greater Syria tended to be more attentive than muftis without an official appointment to the arguments advanced by their colleagues who were affiliates with the Ottoman learned hierarchy. This is also to a large degree the case as far as Al-Haskafi's bibliography is concerned. And a prime example for this, by the way, is in our recent study of the Muqaddimah, or the introduction of Ad-Durr al-Mukhtar. We see that Al-Haskafi quite clearly says the following, as you can see in the center of the screen, and he's basically saying that whenever you don't see me quoting or directly referencing a quote in my book Ad-Durr al-Mukhtar, then assume it to be from Durar al-Hukam, which is a book written by a scholar from the Ottoman learned hierarchy. Now there's also an interesting comment on page 52, which is that if you were a scholar in Ottoman lands, then if you were a scholar in the Ottoman period and you traveled to Istanbul or you traveled to Constantinople, that would increase your chances of an imperial appointment, i.e. that would increase your chances of becoming an official mufti, an official judge at some point. So he says, from the biographies of the appointed muftis, it is clear that traveling to Istanbul increased a jurist's chance at appointment. There's another interesting comment or point on page 118, wherein the author speaks about how the Mongol invasions may have been the cause of many books being written on the biographies of the scholars, because perhaps the Mongols destroyed so many books, you could say, on the biographies of the scholars, that scholars actually felt like we need to write books as a, you could say, to kind of make up for what we've lost. So he says, in his groundbreaking study of an early 15th century Shafi'i Tabaqat work, Kevin Jacques has observed the relatively massive production of Tabaqat works in the 14th and 15th century. The sudden rise in the production of Tabaqat works, Jacques has convincingly argued, should be attributed to a sense of a crisis of authority shared by main jurists in the centuries following the catastrophic events of the 13th and 14th century, namely the Mongol invasions and the outbreak of the Black Death. So the Black Death may have also caused scholars to write more books on the Tabaqat and biographies of the scholars. Then on page 158, and we have perhaps what I would say an example of the author reading too much into certain things. You have an example wherein the author argues that when Hibatullah al-Ba'ali, one of the people who Ibn Abidin had ijazah from, when he is critiquing the unreliable books in the Hanafi madhhab, the author states that he seems to be critiquing the Ottoman imperial canon, which is the books that the Ottomans considered in the Hanafi madhhab to be authoritative. So he writes, and he's speaking about Hibatullah al-Ba'ali's comments, And he says, because of the brevity of the discussion in those books, Al-Ba'li complains they tend to be obscure and often include opinions that are not reliable. Moreover, he further explains, the authors of those books prefer tarjih, the view that contradicts the preferable opinion within the Hanafi madhhab, and in some cases to promote an opinion that is not ascribed to any authority within the madhhab. He carries on, the works on which Al-Ba'li chose to focus his attention, all of which were part of the Ottoman imperial canon of the 18th century, strongly suggest that by people of the time, he refers to members of the Ottoman learned hierarchy. So Al-Ba'li is responding to the Ottoman ulama to some degree. In the conclusion to this book, by the way, the author also speaks about the Mughal Empire, and in particular he makes mention of Fatawa Alamgiriya, and he mentions how the Fatawa Alamgiriya wasn't just relied in the Mughal Empire, it was actually relied in the Ottoman lands as well. So he writes on page 213, and he's speaking in the footnotes here, he says, despite the Mughal sponsorship, Al-Fatawa Al-Alamgiriya was widely consulted in other parts of the Hanafi world, especially in the Ottoman Empire. As we know, the authors of Al-Majalla also relied upon Al-Fatawa Al-Alamgiriya as well. All in all, a really interesting and amazing book, and one that I would highly recommend for anyone who's interested in the Hanafi madhhab to have a read at, and it'll definitely improve your understanding of the development of the madhhab. The book is available on Amazon. I'll put a link in the description if you want to purchase the book. I do hope you enjoyed this video, and I want to see you in the next video inshallah. Jazakumullah khair wa ahsan jaza. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.